Hello and welcome to the third Halo Custom Edition map design tutorial. Here is where we left off in the second part. Before we go any further, I did save at the end of the last video, but I'm just going to save again, and then I'm going to save this as a new file, 03. And just looking around at the base here, I noticed sort of drop off, which instead of, I don't think that can be remedied by just pulling that vert up, or maybe it can. So yeah, I'll just do that. I was going to go ahead and use soft selection, but that seems to have done the trick, so there's no need. What I am going to do is, before we go any further, do a little bit of management with my edge thickness and whatnot. So I'm going to isolate this by hitting the light bulb, and I'm going to, under my constraints, set an edge constraint. So that means that when I move my vertices, I can only move them along the associated edge, and pretty much that's what that does. So I'm just sorting out a few problem areas where the polygons do get a little bit too thick, and there is a little bit of mismatching here and there. Again, this will help you in the long run, so it's best to do it now rather than cry about it later. And I think that's okay. I am worried about that piece there. I am just going to double click that edge and just get rid of it. And I'm going to target weld this unnecessary thing there. Target weld that there. Target weld that, I think. No, I'll bring that back. And I'll pull it in a little bit more. We'll get rid of this. And we'll get rid of you too. Pull that in slightly. Get rid of that annoying triangle there. Collapse those two. And no, we should be okay. For now. Alright, now, before we move on, it's going to be a good idea to kind of visualize what this is going to look like when we apply a geometry smooth algorithm to this. So you have a couple of options. You can either use NURMS subdivision, which is a really old kind of algorithm. So if we select that, you can see that get rid of our cage, and if we undo our edges by hitting F4, you can see what that does. We can add more iterations and that will smooth out for us. Kind of an old method. I don't really use it anymore, so we're not going to use that. I much prefer the mesh smooth method. So the way I'm going to use that is we're going to go into polygon mode, hit Control A. This will tell the mesh smooth modifier that we want to mesh smooth everything except perhaps no, we'll mesh smooth everything. So it's right under quick slice, and you can see that it does a fairly decent job of adding geometry into our map whilst also smoothing out and relaxing the mesh. So that's one iteration. I'm going to add one more and then we can now do some detailing. So if everything looks faceted and ugly still, just hit Control A again, select all the polygons, and ooh, my menus are a little screwed up here. Add a smoothing grip. So since we're working with an organic shape, one smoothing grip should be enough. And now you can kind of get the idea of where using the freeform polydraw strip idea, why that is indeed so useful. Okay, and I'm not really sure if no, actually this amount of mesh smooth is okay, I think. The one problem that I do have is this is a little bit dark, so I'm going to lighten up the diffuse color in our shader here. That's so we have nice silver going on now. And what I'm going to do now is incorporate the soft selection again. So we're going to go into vertex mode, expand the soft selection dialog. We're going to check use soft selection, and I've set my fall off to, we'll just set it to 1500. Right, I'm going to adjust my pinch slightly to 0.2 and push my bubble up to 0.09. Now it kind of resembles, well, I'm not going to say what it resembles, but yeah. Alright, so now the idea here is to add variation, just pull different parts out, creating, kind of stylistic blobs, in essence, up and down, in and out, whatever you feel is good for you, go ahead and do it. There's no right or wrong technique here. It's just really about what you want and how you're going to get achieve your look. We're going to do a little bit more soft selection later on. So what I'd suggest here, if you're not sure, what you're really supposed to be doing, just try and exaggerate certain shapes, certain curves by pulling them out more, and don't be afraid of being too overt, because we are going to add another mesh smooth iteration later on, so this will all relax out, hopefully. And if you're unsure about this again, then what you can do is just go ahead and save from where you are now, and then start with a new file by saving as, like we did at the start of this video. There's really no need to kind of be scared about what you're doing here. I've switched into polygon mode. Polygon and edge mode, they both work with soft selection. I've just chosen polygon mode because you can see what I'm doing a little bit easier more than anything else. I would prefer to use vertex mode, but I don't really think you guys are getting the full impression of what's going on here, so I'm going to be using this mode instead. By the way, with soft selection, you're not just, if I haven't already mentioned this before, you're not just restricted to using the select and move gizmo. You can also use the rotate gizmo to rotate certain pieces like so, or you can scale it in or out, whatever you want to do. It's up to you. Just really be aware of just how tight the polygons are getting. So I really don't want to go anymore, push this down any more than that. So that's just one thing I would say about the soft selection tool, because it can be really easy to do that, and that's going to make your life a pain when we add even more geometry, because little portions like that are going to start to intercede with each other. That's going to create problems for us later on. Okay, and just going to push that forward. Although I did say that you can use other tools here, I'm not really sticking to my own advice too much. I'm going to make fall off a little. Smaller, so we can start pushing out individual details. I have shown this method prior to one other person, and that guy actually said that this looks very much like what you'd be doing in ZBrush, where you're sculpting polygons instead of modeling them in, which is kind of true, but I would go against ZBrush for this type of thing for two reasons. Number one, the amount of control you have in ZBrush is fairly good, but it's not the same as 3ds Max, since you're not really messing around with individual vertices and edges. You're really working with polygons and nothing else. Number two, it can really be hard to take down a high poly mesh in ZBrush and optimize it into a game ready format, whereas in 3ds Max we don't have to worry about that, since we have smoothing groups doing most of the smoothing work for us, and whereas in ZBrush you're heavily reliant on adding extra geometry and extra detail in order to create that smooth look, which is, I mean, using ZBrush conceptually, just to kind of define a certain look, maybe get a few artistic references on the screen. That's totally fine with me, but I personally would not use a ZBrush model, simply because I really don't think that I'd be able to import it into Max and have 3ds Max handle all the files, all the detail and whatnot, unless I figured out a certain workflow. I know that ZBrush uses the decimator tool to bring down ridiculously high sculpted triangle counts and whatnot. So there is that option, but personally, I find it much cooler to kind of use this 3ds Max method rather than ZBrush. But I haven't tried ZBrush personally. In this sense, I've used ZBrush before, and it's a really good program, but I would generally advise against using sculpting programs like ZBrush or Sculptris or stuff like that. Primarily, as I said before, because it's kind of hard to transfer them into a 3D application from a sculpting program. So going back to what we're doing here, if you find you're selecting way too much, go ahead and bring down the fall off. I usually tend to do this when I want to pick out certain details. The lower your fall off is, the more the more pronounced your detail is going to be, because you're selecting less of it. So you're making less of an impact on the general mesh and making more of an impact on a certain part of the mesh. Therefore, that's going to stand out a little bit more than it ordinarily would. Again, I'm not doing anything too fancy. I'm really just using the center square and the gizmo to plop out certain parts. Your grandma could do this, to be honest. I'm going to expand my gizmo by hitting the plus key. You can bring it down using the minus key if you want to. It's just getting a little bit tedious trying to find the certain axis or axes that I want to drag out my polygons at. And as I was saying before, using a lighter fall off value will help you accentuate those details. I'm going to bring that back up actually, just for now. I'd use a higher value just so I can really deform major parts of the mesh, and then I will go in and start bringing that fall off down, and then start defining really little regions, pulling in and pulling out, just so I can exaggerate certain portions of the mesh in certain ways. It's very important that you grasp the idea of how much is appropriate and where it should be applied to, where it is appropriate on your mesh specifically, because you can throw a lot of detail at a model, and at the end of the day it'll be a really detailed model, but it's just going to be too busy visually. There's not going to be parts of the mesh where your eye can relax and adjust to. And similarly, you can also just get meshes which look too boring, rather than meshes which just are visually just too rich, so that I can't really focus in on one point and appreciate what's going on there. Now I've run out of things to talk about. And I think I'm going to either leave it here or stop here. I think we've done quite a lot here. I'm not too happy about, how boring it kind of looks in certain areas. I'm a little tempted to go ahead and go behind the scenes and play around a little bit more, but I'm not going to do that because that's not really fair to you guys. Other than then what really is the point of the tutorial if I'm only showing you half the stuff I'm doing. But yeah, that's what I have so far. And in the next tutorial, we're going to be pretty much doing the same thing to the floor. And then we're going to add another mesh smooth iteration, and then we're going to explore a few more of the paint deform tools which we have here. So that's it for part 3, and I'll see you in the 4th element of this Halo Custom Edition map creation video tutorial guide. Ooh, before we go, I'm going to save.